For Korean Peninsula in Washington, D.C., Sharon Squassoni, the research professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the George Washington University. In D.C., Yang Ki Kim Reno, senior advisor at the Institute for Korean Studies in the George Washington University. In Washington, D.C. as well, Peter Kuznick, professor and director at Nuclear Studies Institute with American University. Last but not least, in Beijing, Zhao Tong, senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure to see all of you. A lot of latest development regarding the Korean Peninsula. For example, Ms. Squassoni, the latest visit by the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea with his South Korean counterpart. Much analysis about exactly what's the significance of that visit.
Well, I think you have to step back a little bit.
Okay.
First, it's very significant that Sung Kim was made the representative. Since he is an extremely seasoned diplomat, he's done this a few times before. As a matter of fact, he served as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea. And second, this trip to visit South Korea, with meeting with Korean and Japanese allies, is all about showing that we will stand with our allies with respect to North Korean policy. But I think it's all positive that this is moving so early in the administration.
One of the things that he and the South Korean counterparts did to scrap off a mechanism, so-called a special group on North Korea and sanctions, which DPRK has been complaining about because it's mainly about putting sanctions on the DPRK. Now, is that going to be a positive step forward, or it is mainly decorations and gestures?
I think this probably symbolizes an effort that they are willing to start in a little different direction than so far. So I guess details are to be seen.
Very interesting. I love the way you put it in such a measured words. Mr. Zhao, I want to go to you about that. Do you see that very little change of direction, or it is mainly the same logic, just put it in very different context?
Well, I think the working group was set up during the Trump administration, if I remember correctly. The main goal was originally to coordinate between US and South Korea about what inter-Korean economic projects or activities can be exempted from sanctions.
Yeah.
That was during a time when there was some hope of quick and substantial inter-Korean economic exchange. But now I think the ending of this working group, in some sense, is a recognition of a new fact where no one is really expecting major developments, especially in the economic arena. There is no sign that there is going to be new and big inter-Korean economic projects. So there is nothing to really talk about in terms of exempting such projects from international sanctions. So I read it as a signal that we probably won't see much positive development in terms of relaxing sanctions on North Korea.
And we're seeing also quite paralleled reactions coming from the DPRK. I would focus on the use of name of DPRK because that's how the DPRK considers should be respected for the name, but you can go with whatever form you like. Coming from the foreign minister of DPRK, quote, "We are not considering even the possibility of any contact with the U.S., let alone having it, which would get us nowhere, only taking up precious time," end of quote. That is from the official news agency, KCNA, from the DPRK. Mr. Kuznick, professor, is that much surprise? Or the DPRK has learned from earlier bites dealing with the Trump administration?
Well, it's not a big surprise, but it's also not the best news we might hope for. Sung Kim had said he's ready to meet with the DPRK officials anywhere, anytime, without preconditions. But the response from the DPRK was, well, we'll meet with you when we're ready under our own conditions and our own terms. We'll set the terms of this relationship. So right now there's kind of a posturing going on, and it's going to take a little while before something concrete develops. So I think we've got to be patient.
We really need to know the other party in order to make a progress in either dialogue or communication. So, Ms. Squassoni, if, as far as I understand, covering several Kim-Trump summit in Singapore, in Vietnam, I saw almost none U.S. concessions. Well, the DPRK claimed that it has made its effort. So, without removing the earlier sanctions against DPRK, without making sure there's going to be adequate exchange of conditions between the two sides, Washington and Pyongyang, one would really wonder, why would DPRK want to have any discussion with Washington anyway, Mrs. Squassoni?
Well, I think their interest in discussing anything with Washington is related to the sanctions, obviously. And, you know, in Hanoi, Kim Jong-un offered to close down Yongbyon in exchange for having all the sanctions lifted from 2016. And North Korea has been under US sanctions since 1950. But the Trump administration really ratcheted those up. And, you know, I don't blame them for feeling burned by the Trump administration because, frankly, Mr. Trump promised a lot of things. I mean, the Singapore summit was quite, you know, he was quite expansive of talking about a new relationship with North Korea. But they've got to, I'm sure that some kind of sanctions relief is the first thing they're going to ask for. And the question is, what is the Biden administration willing to put on the table?
We have not seen the United States, its relations with Iran, with the DPRK, with some of the hotspot issues, and of course with Russia and China, have been in any way improved, but rather probably even deteriorated over the past few months. With that as reference, Mr. Zhao, do you see much confidence that the DPRK could have about this current administration, even though many people want to blame the Trump administration?
Well, I think for the credit of the Biden administration, it did North Korea policy review, which was generally welcomed by American experts as well as other countries in this region, especially South Korea, Japan, etc. I think a key point of the Biden's new North Korea policy is to be willing to embrace the incremental approach of achieving denuclearization. That is a major change from the all or nothing approach of the Biden administration. Biden emphasizes repeatedly that U.S. is willing to diplomacy with North Korea and has designated a special representative and starting coordination with allies. I think all those are positive signals. However, from the North Korean perspective, I also understand they don't think that is enough. The recent statement from the party plenum, during which the North Korean leadership basically said North Korea needs to be prepared for both dialogue and confrontation. Well, some read that as a positive signal from North Korea, but I think it would be more accurate to say that North Korea was repeating the same rhetoric that the ball is in American court. So North Korea basically wants to see some concrete proposal from the U.S. to have an understanding what substantive benefit North Korea can expect if diplomacy starts. So I hope Biden can put something more substantive on the table to attract North Korea to
I love
negotiate.
that word, substantive. So, Professor Kusnik, what could be in the substance that Washington can propose? Of course, I'm not saying you're representing the White House, but I'm just saying, as an expert, what could be in that first message?
And it's very confusing for other countries to deal with the United States when it comes to foreign policy, because our policies change so frequently. With each new administration, we get a change in policy. So that's very disorienting. But clearly, Biden wants to differentiate himself from Trump. So as we were saying, there's not going to be this grand bargain. We're not going to talk about complete denuclearization in exchange for peace and sanctions. We're going to be looking for an incremental approach. Now, there are various things that both sides can offer. For example, the United States, clearly what the DPRK wants is a reduction in sanctions.
Right.
But it also wants peace on the peninsula. You know, we're still technically at war. We have not ended the Korean War yet. We still have just that armistice agreement. So there are things that can be offered in terms of economic relief as well as political relief and in terms of moving the peninsula toward peace.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Kim Reynolds?
President Biden's strategy is maybe ultimate denuclearization, but not the condition for the talk to go on, because that way everybody can get out of this catch-22 situation. So probably it's more pragmatic and realistic. President Biden has a long experience with foreign policy, and he also relies on real experts rather than trying to make all the decisions himself. So this is a natural consequence, trying to take incremental and positive thinking that something can come out of the real dialogue. As I have repeated many times,
I see.
We need to convince each other of the sincerity we have.
Can I understand this incremental, if I put it in such a blunt way, because I cannot afford it, because I'm a journalist. That means almost nothing happens except to create a good nuance, an atmosphere. Ms. Squasoni?
So you would be right to be a little skeptical of incremental
As a
progress,
journalist, I could.
but
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, but there are things I think that would really be helpful. So one is, under the agreed framework, North Korea froze the plutonium portion of its program, and it had international inspectors on the ground. They have not been there for a long time. Focusing on Yongbyon, that facility where there's a reactor and a reprocessing plant and some enrichment, that's not a bad idea. I think, though, we need to do more than that. But getting international inspectors on the ground could be quite helpful. It's, the Biden administration has said, look, it's not the grand bargain from the Trump administration, but I think they learned the lesson from the Obama administration that strategic patience only results in North Korea continuing to build up its program. Yeah. And I would just say, in January of this year, Kim Jong-un gave a speech in which it was almost as if he were imitating Vladimir Putin, where he talked about all these fabulous new weapons that, North Korea was going to have, including hypersonic glide vehicles and multiple warheads. I think he almost thinks, look, we have to sort of, I don't want to say exaggerate the threat in order to get the U.S. attention. But I do think that there's a lot of space to make some significant progress.
Like what?
Well, so one, getting inspectors on the ground. Two, building confidence. I would say that
rather the other way around, building confidence first and then get inspectors on the ground.
I think they go together.
I think, right?
Yes, there is a certain, and actually that's why I think that Sung Kim is a fantastic person to do this, because he's been there before. It's actually hopefully helpful that, they recognize him, they know him, there's a history
right.
there. So maybe that can help build a little bit of confidence.
I would love to focus on the capabilities of individuals, because that usually gives us a lot of hope. But we have to also look at the bigger picture. the geopolitical picture, for example, what we have now, very much different from a few years ago. China and the United States both are important parties in that the denuclearization group. Now we have seen between them very much unpredictable future, and things are deteriorating every day as we see it. Meanwhile, there is an issue about what the U.S. is likely to do with its allies vis-à-vis the DPRK, vis-à-vis China in the Asia-Pacific region. South Korea's fate in that regard will be also unpredictable depending on what its choice is and how it's likely to be, related to many other players in the region. And we also see China-Japan relations not necessarily improving under these current circumstances. Meanwhile, the pandemic. So all of things added up. What are we talking about in terms of the Korean Peninsula future? Mr. Zhao.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question. I was in a few expert-level dialogues with American experts, South Korean experts, etc. They all emphasized one thing, which is the importance to have U.S.-China coordination on North Korea policy as soon as possible. People all recognize the importance of the two major powers being on the same page and have a coordinated policy towards North Korea. Biden has made an important summit with Russian President Putin. Everyone is now talking about when Biden will meet with the Chinese president. Mm-hmm. And if they do so in the near-term future, I think they really should put North Korea in their discussion agenda. And, I guess you are not asking me about South Korea, so I'll leave it to other experts.
Yes. About South Korea, I want to go to you, Ms. Kim Reno. It's in a tricky situation, but denuclearization certainly in the interest of South Korea. South Korea also want to have a good relationship with China because China-South Korea trade and neighborhoods, these are all very important to South Korea. But what about that?
I really cannot speak for the South Korean.
No, but just as an observer.
I think it can also be an opportunity. Their political and economical and then other significance in the world stage is increasingly being recognized, and they are playing the role that they probably have not previously required of the world situation.
Right.
And they are capable of making a difference these days.
Back to South Korea. South Korea is always in a delicate position. South Korea is not playing into U.S. hands entirely on this. South Korea has not joined the Quad. South Korea is not working to contain and isolate China in the same way that Japan and Australia and the U.S. are doing, and India, now with India. So South Korea is in a difficult situation. It is actually participating in the sea breeze operation in the Black Sea with the U.S. and 31 other countries right now, but it is not playing the same game in vis-a-vis China.
South Korea just made public that its name is there, but it's not sending any specific presence in that military operation. By the way, this is the latest from South Korea. But don't let me interrupt you. Go ahead, sir.
But the context that you were talking about, the geostrategic situation, the U.S. is maintaining its policy toward China that many of the people in the Biden administration go back to the Obama administration. And some of them are pretty hawkish. But the thing that they all agreed on was the pivot toward China, the pivot toward Asia, a containment policy toward China. One of the key policymakers is Kurt Campbell, who really was the architect of that policy. But even people like Blinken and Sullivan were part of that. You also, in my view, have a counterweight, and that's Wendy Sherman, who played a more positive role, both in terms of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but also in terms of earlier negotiations with North Korea. So, and Biden himself, I don't know for sure where he comes out, because he in some ways has been a voice for less military confrontational policies, and in some ways he's gone along with some of those policies.
So from China's perspective, Mr. Zhao, where is the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue?
I think China feels positive about the new Biden policy on North Korea. The incremental approach basically aligns well with China's proposal for a phased step-by-step approach to resolve North Korea's nuclear problem. So I think that creates opportunity for better coordination with the United States. I think the key challenge from the Chinese perspective is the sequencing issue, who to make the first step. And here, maybe US and China can talk more substantively with each other. North Korea expects some more substantial offer from US, and maybe China can work with the United States to jointly offer some vaccines or medical aids to North Korea as an inducement for North Korea to come back to the negotiating table. Then it's up to US and North Korea to discuss, how they are going to respectively implement the incremental approach.
The latest development on the human rights is quite intense. If you look at the Human Rights Commission's discussion right now that is taking place at the United Nations, it seems that China and US have been accusing one another of human rights issues. Will that create a good atmosphere for anything, or human rights will be the thing that's likely to block everything from going forward, or countries will use human rights as one of those tools for their own benefits? These are very interesting to me. Mrs. Guasong.
Right. Well, that's always the danger, that they, that there's too much linkage. There are very few countries on this planet that don't have some human rights issues. President Biden has long been, has a long track record on human rights. And so I would just note that as it's a possible wrench in the works somewhere down the line. This was on the agenda with Russia. And Mr. Biden did not shy away from that. It could be problematic with China and certainly with North Korea.
Earlier, when we discussed the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, there are several areas that people know that they could focus on and solve the problem. But now we have so many moving factors right in front of us on any of these areas. And it makes policy discussions fascinating, but certainly reality is hard to deal with. But I want to thank every one of you for your expertise and your insights. By the way, also constructive spirits. Sharon Squassony, Yang Ki, Kim Rino, Peter Kuznick, and last but not least, Zhao Tong. Thank you so much. Take care.